Arequipa by Ben Okri. Leaves that fall ought to breed fire from stone. The world counts on our fall, our solitude interests, the butterflies and the lost gold of the afternoons. Ochre and blue walls, and the fading peaks of volcanoes, and the sunlight plummeting beyond. The hills waken, leaves to their lost trees. To discover you still have a world to make at sunset sobers the stones. Arequipa by Ben Okri. That's the poem of the day. Like I said, I really do like sticking with this. I think it's a fun little way to have. Obviously, we're reading Halo Contact Harvest, but Halo is not going to be the most advanced book of all time. So I feel like this is a fun way to read a book that interests me, and if you're watching, I'm assuming it interests you, especially since we're on like chapter 12. If you're randomly tuning in to chapter 12 of Halo Contact Harvest, did you like lose your book in the middle of reading or something? Like genuinely, I'd like to know. Anyway, I feel like the poem of the day is a fun way to just share art and poems and make us all smarter. Anyway, chapter 12. Wow, I know exactly where I'm at. Chapter 12, Halo Contact Harvest. Covenant Lesser Missionary Allotment. Didab had turned off all the escape pods' non-critical systems to conserve power. That included the lights, but he could clearly see, lighter than some, resting against the ceiling. The Huragok glowed with faint pink light, not unlike the zap jellies that filled the brackish seas of the Ungoy homeworld. But that's where the similarity ended. Lighter than some looked pitiful, not predatory. The gas sacks on its back were almost completely deflated, and the multi-chambered organ that dangled from the bottom of its spine looked unusually long and shriveled, stretched out like a deflated balloon. Lighter than some, cilia-covered tentacles barely moved as it suggested, "Try." Didab tugged his mask away from his face with a wet pop. He took a cautious breath. The pod was full of cold, viscous methane that clung to the back of his throat, slunk down his larynx into his lungs. Good, Didab signed, fighting the urge to cough. He clipped his mask to his shoulder harness so it wouldn't float away in the pod's zero gravity, but also to keep it handy in case he needed a supplementary drag from his tank. Lighter than some quivered, a gesture that was equal parts relief and exhaustion. As much as it had tinkered, the Huragok had been unable to coax the pod's life support system into generating the methane Didab needed to survive. While the lighter than some had been baffled by what it thought was a nonsensical hardware limitation, it made grim sense to Didab. In the event of evacuation, the Kigyar ship mistress had simply planned to leave her Ungoy deacon behind. So with one of Didab's tanks fully drained and the second half empty, there had been only one solution. Lighter than some would have to produce the methane itself. "Best batch yet," Didab signed encouragingly. The Huragok made no reply. Instead, it plucked a passing food pouch from the air, jammed it in its snout, and began to eat. Didab watched the thick brown sludge surge up its snout and down its spine in tight, peristaltic knots. The Huragok's worm-like stomach swelled, twisting and pinching its other innards. Just when Didab thought lighter than some couldn't possibly eat anymore, it removed its snout from the thoroughly vacuumed pouch, belched, and promptly fell asleep. Huragok weren't picky eaters. For them, any properly pulped substance was suitable for ingestion. Their stomachs passed the nastiest stuff, what other species would consider garbage or worse to the anaerobic sacs that dangled from the bottom of their spinal column. These sacs were filled with bacteria that converted organic material to energy, giving off methane and trace amounts of hydrogen sulfide. Usually, Huragok only resorted to anaerobic digestion as a last resort. Methane was a heavy gas relative to the helium that filled a good number of its dorsal sacs, and even minor weight shifts could cause dangerous changes in buoyancy. Plus, from a comfort point of view, Huragok just didn't like the feeling of a bacteria-filled bag dangling between their lower tentacle pair. It stressed the limbs and decreased their mobility, making it much more difficult to talk. Unfortunately, the amount of methane Dadaab required far exceeded what any Huragok could safely produce. Lighter than Some had to suck down tremendous amounts of food to keep the bacterial process going, which made it very heavy. And to create sufficiently large batches, it had to force its anaerobic sac to swell, thinning out its walls. In short, keeping Dadaab alive was a debilitating, painful process that would have been completely impossible in anything but a zero-G environment. Had there been gravity inside the pod, Lighter than Some would have soon collapsed onto the floor. Mindful of his companion's suffering, Dadaab felt tremendous guilt as he watched the sludge leach from Lighter than Some's stomach into its anaerobic sac. Slowly, its shriveled membranes began to inflate, turning a sickly yellow as the bacteria blooms inside got to work on another batch. Much later, when the cycle was complete, the sac had tripled in size, making it the Huragok's largest protuberance. Lighter than Some shuddered, and Dadaab grasped two of its tentacles, braced himself against the curved wall of the pod as the anaerobic sac blew its valve. The Huragok fluttered as it released a shimmering plume of methane. When its sac was spent, the chapped valve shut with a mournful squeak. Dadaab gently pushed his companion back toward the ceiling, where he would be less likely to bump it, and released its quaking limbs. Lighter than Some had now performed dozens of these exhalations, each more difficult than the last. The creature no longer had the energy to monitor the pressure in its other sacs. Soon, zero gravity or not, it would lose its essential turgor, collapse upon itself, and suffocate. After that, Dadaab knew his own life would be dependent on how long he could take very short, very shallow breaths. But he was actually more frightened by what would happen if he lived. Ruefully, he glanced at the 3 alien boxes Lighter than Some had brought aboard the pod. Floating in the darkness, their intertwined circuits glinted in the Huragok's dim light. Connecting intelligent circuits was verboten, one of the Covenant's major sins. The deacon had only a layman's understanding of why this was so, but he knew the taboo had its roots in the Forerunners' long war against a prodigious parasite known as the Flood. In this war, the Forerunners had used high-order, distributed intelligences to contain and combat their enemy. But somehow their strategy had failed. The Flood had corrupted some of these artificial minds and turned them against their makers. As Dadaab understood the relevant holy scriptures, the Flood had perished in a final, cataclysmic event. The Forerunners activated their ultimate weapon, 7 mythical ring artifacts known collectively as Halo. The prophets preached that Halo not only destroyed the Flood, but somehow also initiated the Forerunners' great journey. Recently, the prophets had begun downplaying the myth, promoting a more measured approach to divination that encouraged the gradual accumulation of lesser relics. That encouraged. But breaking Forerunner taboos remained a sin, and one of the great burdens of Dadaab's deaconship was full knowledge of the punishment for every transgression. For the sin of so-called intelligence association, death in this life and damnation in the next. But Dadaab also knew that connecting the alien boxes was essential if they were to have any hope of rescue. The Kigyar pod lacked a long-range beacon, which would have been fine in Covenant space, where ships were regularly scanned for castaways. But out here, in the middle of nowhere, a rescuer would only know to look 2 places: Minor Transgression's point of contact with the first alien vessel, and the coordinates at which Dadaab had re-enabled the Luminary, the last 2 places the Kigyar ship had made transmissions. Given that the latter would probably soon be swarmed by more of the violent aliens, backtracking was the more prudent choice. But the pod had no record of minor transgressions' travels. It would need information from the alien boxes. Before the Huragok passed this information on, it had wanted the boxes to come to an agreement on the proper coordinates. The pod only had enough fuel for one more jump, and even Dadab had agreed that they needed to get it right. His first methane tank dwindling, the Deacon had watched with terrified resignation as a Huragok gently probed the interiors of the boxes with its tentacles, coaxing their circuits together, gradually understanding more of their simple binary language and passing relevant information to the pod. Eventually, Lighter Than Some's sinful efforts had paid off. The pod exited its jump smack in the middle of an expanding sphere of debris that a quick sensor scan positively identified as the remains of the first alien vessel. For a moment, Dadab's heart soared. Despite his litany of transgressions, conspiracy to commit false witness, accessory to the destruction of ministry property, mutiny, might not the prophets show him mercy? In the end, he had done the right thing, exposed Cheryar's treachery, and transmitted the location of the reliquary. He was hopeful that would count for something, but then came the revelation that the pod's life support system was fatally flawed, and after many cycles without any sign of rescue, Dadab had slunk into a deep depression. "I will die," he moaned, adrift in a mess of crumpled food pouches and his own carefully bagged filth, without even having had a chance to beg the prophets for forgiveness. The Deacon had allowed himself to wallow this way for quite some time, until the stress of Lighter Than Some's methane production became too difficult to ignore. And in that moment, Dadab's self-pity evolved into something less reprehensible: shame. For while he might face terrible punishments in the future, the Huragok was in torment now, and entirely for the Deacon's sake. Dadab took a deep breath and held it, let the chill of his friend's selfless efforts sink deep into his chest. He turned to the pod's control panel, brushed the alien boxes aside, and hit the hollow switch that would restore power to the pod's limited sensor gear. "We will both survive this," he vowed, listening to the creak of the Huragok's exhausted sacks, "and whatever happens after." As tired of sleep as any of the pod's scarce distractions, Dadab kept his station before the panel, monitored the sensors, searching for any hint of an approaching ship. He tried to breathe as little as possible, and only broke his watch to help the Huragok feed. Many more cycles passed. All the while, the alien boxes hummed their petty blasphemies, and Lighter Than Some's sack swelled and shrunk until, without warning, the pod detected a jump signature close at hand, and Dadab at last allowed himself the indulgence of relief. "Castaway vessel, this is Cruiser Rapid Conversion," the hail boomed through the pod. Lighter Than Some released a pained whistle as Dadab fumbled for the switch that would reduce the transmission's volume. "Respond if you are able," the voice continued at a more reasonable level. "We live Rapid Conversion," Dadab replied, voice cracking from lack of use. "But our situation is dire. In the last few cycles, the Huragok's appetite had fallen off. Its anaerobic sac was now producing at a fraction of its previous capacity, and many of Lighter Than Some's dorsal sacs had shut down entirely as their membranes dried out and folded in upon themselves. "I beg you," Dadab gasped. He reached for his mask and took a halting drag from his almost empty second tank. "Please hurry." "Remain calm," the voice growled. "You will soon be brought on board." Dadab did his best to comply. He inhaled the pod's thinning methane in quick, shallow gulps, only resorting to his mask when the burning in his lungs became unbearable. But at some point he must have abstained too long because his world went black and he collapsed. When he awoke, he was belly down on the floor, and he could hear the hiss of fresh methane bleeding into the pod. Dadab's nostrils flared. The gas had a bitter tang, but he thought he'd never tasted anything sweeter. With a happy grunt, he twisted his neck to look up at Lighter Than Some, and was shocked to see the creature crumpled on the floor beside him. They were inside the cruiser, Dadab realized, and its artificial gravity had permeated the pod. Suddenly, there was a furtive scratch at the pod's hatch. Something was trying to force its way inside. "Stop!" Dadab screamed. He leapt to his feet only to have them collapse beneath him. Floating in zero-G, his muscles had atrophied, and the deacon was forced to claw his way along the floor to the control panel. "Don't open the hatch," he shouted, hitting the switch to enable the pod's stasis field. Instantly, the air crackled and thickened. A moment too late, he realized what else the switch would do. The pod's thrusters lit with an ear-splitting roar, and the craft leapt forward with a metal-on-metal screech, then stopped with a monumental clang. The pod's nose crumpled down and in, crushing the 3 alien boxes against the control panel. Restrained by the field, Dadab felt none of the acceleration or impact, but he did have a searing pain in his left arm. Pieces of the boxes had exploded outward, and while the field had quickly stopped the shrapnel, one razor-sharp fragment had sufficient velocity to slice past Dadab, cutting through his hardened skin just below the shoulder. Ignoring the pain, Dadab grasped the Hurgok's tentacles and hoisted the creature from the floor. Its usually clammy flesh felt dry. The deacon knew this wasn't a good sign. As quickly as he thought safe, he puppeteered lighter than Sum's tentacles until it was in a natural pose, snout high, anaerobic sac dangling low. Suspended in the field, the least damage to the Hurgok's sac slowly began to inflate. But Dadab knew it would take time before his friend was ready to float unassisted. Quickly he reached for the control panel and hit a switch to lock the hatch. Heavy footfalls announced the arrival of something massive outside the pod. "By the prophets," a voice thundered. "Are you mad?" "I had no choice," Dadab retorted. The hatch rattled, shaking the entire pod. "Come out this instant," the voice thundered. Dadab recognized it as the same one that had delivered the initial hail. He knew it wasn't Kigyar, or Ungoi, or Sanghili, and certainly not Sanshayum. That left only one possibility. "I will not," Dadab's voice quavered as he thought of whose pride he might be offending. "My Hurgok has lost its balance. I'm sorry, but you'll just have to wait." If Maccabeus had been on the cruiser's bridge, he would have immediately learned of the accident in the hangar. But here, inside Rapid Conversion's feasting hall, the Jiralhane chieftain had forbidden all communication. Maccabeus's pack was about to feed, and that could bear no interruption. Given that the Jiralhane chose their leaders first and foremost for their physical prowess, it was no surprise that Maccabeus was master of the cruiser. Standing on his 2 trunk-like legs, the chieftain was an absolute giant, a head taller than any Sanghili, and much more massive. Thick cords of muscle ripped beneath his elephantine skin. Tufts of silver hair sprung from the arm, and head holes of his leather tabard. He was bald, but his wide jaw bristled with a terrific set of mutton chops. For all his ferocious brawn, the chieftain showed uncanny poise. Feet planted in a deep lunge, he stood in the center of the feasting hall with both arms stretched out behind him, a pose that suggested he was about to perform an imminent and powerful leap. But a single line of sweat dripping from the tip of his broad nose made it clear Maccabeus had held this precarious position for quite some time, and yet he barely moved a muscle. The 8 other males that made up the chieftain's pack weren't nearly so relaxed. Arranged in a semicircle behind Maccabeus, they all held the same pose, but their tan and brown pelts were drenched in sweat. They had all begun to shake, and few were in such obvious discomfort they had begun to shift their feet on the hall's slate floor. To be fair, the pack was desperately tired and hungry. Maccabeus had them at their stations well ahead of the Rapid Conversion's return to normal space. And although a battery of scans had found nothing but the Kigyar escape pod, the chieftain had kept them on high alert until he was confident the cruiser was otherwise alone. Such caution was unusual for a Jiralhane, but the chieftain's authority over his pack relied on rigid rules of dominance, and likewise he was sworn to follow orders from his own alpha male, the Vice Minister of Tranquility, who had insisted Maccabeus proceed with all possible restraint. When the Jiralhane were discovered by the Covenant, They had recently concluded a mechanized war of attrition in which the various master packs had pummeled each other back to a pre-industrial state. The Jirohane were only just recovering, rediscovering radio and rocketry and these technologies, war-fighting potential, when the first Sanshayum missionaries alighted on their hardscrabble planet. Heavy double doors swung open across the hall for Maccabeus. Like the interlocking beams that supported the room's ceiling, the doors were forged steel, streaked with imperfections from rushed annealing. The metal was an unusual material for a Covenant vessel, even one as old as rapid conversion. But of all the modifications Maccabeus had made to his ship, he had taken the most pains with the feasting hall. He'd wanted it to feel authentic, right down to the oil-burning lamps and their clawfoot floor stands. Their crackling wicks lit the room a variable amber hue. 6 Ungoi stewards staggered through the door, carrying a large wooden platter. The platter was twice as wide as any of the stewards was tall, and its slight concavity offered just enough support for its slippery load. The glistening carcass of a roasted thorn beast. The docile herd animal was served back up and legs splayed, and even though the cruiser's Ungoi cooks had dutifully removed its head and neck, both of which had high concentrations of neurotoxins, there was still barely room on the platter for a selection of dipping sauces, fatty reductions of the creature's savory entrails. The heady aroma of the thorn beast's perfectly roasted meat set the Jirohane's stomachs growling. But all continued to hold their poses as the stewards muscled the platter onto 2 grease-stained wooden sawhorses in the middle of the floor's stone mosaic. The Ungoi bowed to Maccabeus and backed through the doors, shutting them as quietly as their poorly oiled hinges allowed. "This is how we keep our faith," Maccabeus' voice rumbled in his chest. "How we honor those who walk the path." In a fleet dominated by Sangheli, it was rare for a Jirohane to have his own ship. For that reason alone, Maccabeus had his pack's respect, but they honored their chieftain for a different reason. His unshakable faith in the promise of the Forerunners and their great journey. At last, Maccabeus swung his arms and shifted his weight forward. He stepped slowly toward the mosaic, a circular mandala, the boundary of which was dominated by 7 multicolored rings, each comprised of a different material. At the center of each ring was a simplified version of a Forerunner glyph. The sort of basic designs one might expect to see in a primer on more advanced religious concepts. The chieftain stepped into a ring of obsidian shards. "Abandonment," he boomed. "The first age," the pack snapped, their teeth wet with saliva. "Ignorance and fear." Maccabeus moved clockwise to a second ring of iron. "Conflict," he said sternly. "The second age, rivalry and bloodshed." Maccabeus had picked his pack, assessed each member as it grew from whelp to adult. Based on the strength of their convictions, for him it was belief that made the warrior, not strength or speed or cunning, though his pack had all this and more. And at times like these, he was most satisfied with his selections. "Reconciliation," Maccabeus growled, inside a ring of polished jade. "The third, humility and brotherhood." Despite their growing hunger, the pack would not think of interrupting their chieftain, as he performed the progression of the ages, blessed their meat, and gave thanks for the safe conclusion of their jump. Less disciplined Jirohane would have quickly lost patience and torn willy-nilly into the delectable beast. "Discovery," the chieftain rumbled, stomping in a ring of geodes, the halved stones stuck to his feet like tiny open mouths. "Fourth," replied the pack, "wonder and understanding. Conversion. Fifth, obedience and freedom. Doubt. Sixth, faith and patience." At last, Maccabeus reached the final ring, bright flakes of Forerunner alloy generously donated by the Sanshayum. For those of the faith, the sparkling wafers from some unknown godly structure were Rapid Conversion's most precious tonnage. Maccabeus took care to not touch them as he stepped into the ring. "Reclamation," he concluded, his voice full of reverence. "Seventh, journey and salvation," the pack thundered, louder than they had before. "7 rings for 7 ages," the chieftain mused, "to help us remember Halo and its divine light." Like all devout covenant, Maccabeus believed the prophets would someday discover their sacred rings and use them to begin the great journey. Escape this doomed existence as the Forerunners had before, but in the meantime, his pack would eat. "Praise be to the holy prophets," he intoned. "May we help keep them safe as they work to find the path." His pack dropped their arms and settled back upon their heels. By now the tabards were soaked with bitter-smelling sweat. One Jerohane rolled his shoulders, another scratched a demanding itch, but all waited without complaint for their chieftain to take his pick of meat. The thorn beast's ample thighs, hulking ribs, or even its stunted forelegs were all popular first choices. But Maccabeus had an unusual favorite morsel, the smallest of the 5 thorns that ridged the creature's high-arched back. Properly cooked, and as the chieftain worked the thorn back and forth in its socket, he could tell it was, the appendage would pop away from the base of the beast's neck, bringing its muscle bed with it. A tender ball of meat on a crisp and oily cone, an appetizer and dessert. But as the chieftain brought the meatball eagerly to his lips, he felt a rattle on his belt. Transferring the thorn to his offhand, Maccabeus activated his signal unit. "Speak," he barked, keeping his anger in check. "The castaways are aboard," growled Rapid Conversion's security officer, Maccabeus' second in command. "Do they have relics in their possession?" "I cannot tell." Maccabeus dipped the thorn into a bowl of sauce at the edge of the platter. "Did you search them?" "They refused to leave their pod." Standing so close to the thorn beast, Maccabeus' nostrils were permeated with its scent. His appetite piqued, but he wanted to savor his first bite without distraction. "Then perhaps you should remove them. The situation is complex." The security officer's tone was both apologetic and excited. "I think, chieftain, you may wish to assess it for yourself." If it were any other Jerohane, Maccabeus would have given him a roaring reprimand and begun his feast. But the officer was the chieftain's nephew, and while blood ties offered no immunity from discipline, the chieftain held all his pack to the same high standards of obedience. Maccabeus knew that if his nephew said the situation in the hangar needed his attention, it did. He pulled his thorn from the dipping bowl and took as big a bite as he could manage. A third of the meat disappeared into his mouth. The chieftain didn't bother to chew, just let the marbled flesh slide down his gullet, then wedged the thorn back onto the platter. "Begin," he barked, striding through his ravenous pack. "But take care you leave my share." Maccabeus tore off his tabard and tossed it to an Ungoy steward standing beside a second set of steel doors opposite the kitchen. The passage beyond shared none of the feasting hall's traditional craftsmanship. Like those in most every other Covenant vessel, it was all smooth surfaces bathed in soft artificial light. The only difference was there was more obvious imperfections. Some of the light-emitting ceiling strips were burned out. Holographic door locks flickered. Near the end of the passage, coolant dripped from an overhead duct that had gone untended for so long that the greenish liquid had run down the hall and slicked across the floor. Then Maccabeus reached the gravity lift. It was out of service, but more to the point, it had never been in service, not since he had taken possession of the ship. The lift's circular shaft ran vertically through all of Rapid Conversion's decks. But the circuits that controlled its anti-gravity generators had been removed by Sanghili, as had circuits for the cruiser's plasma cannon and a host of other advanced systems. The reason for this wholesale stripping of technology was simple. The Sanghili did not trust the Jerohane. As part of the species confirmation process, some of the Sanghili commanders had declared their strong suspicion before the High Council that the Jerohane's pack mentality would invariably bring the two species into conflict. Dominant Jerohane always fought their way to the top, the commanders argued, and they didn't believe even the Covenant's rigid hierarchy would be sufficient to moderate their natural urges. Until they proved themselves subservient, whatever peaceful urges they had should be aggressively encouraged. It was a reasonable argument, and the High Council imposed clear restrictions on the kinds of technology the Jiralhanae could use. And so, Maccabeus thought, did we set aside out of pride for a higher purpose, instead of pressing a hollow switch to call an elevator, one of the allowable replacements for the grav lift. The chieftain simply turned around and slipped down onto a ladder, one of 4 evenly spaced around the shaft. Like the feasting hall's doors and beams, the ladder's construction was relatively crude. Although the ladder's rungs were worn smooth from frequent use, there were spurs along the rails that indicated a hasty fabrication. There were gaps in the ladders at every deck, but crossing these involved a simple drop or leap, depending on the direction of travel. For the muscular Jiralhanae, this was not so much as an inconvenience as exercise. Maccabeus knew the tank-encumbered Ungoi currently huffing and puffing up the ladders might disagree on this last point, but the shorter creatures were also extremely agile, and as the chieftain began his descent to the hangar, an Ungoi leapt to another ladder and let him pass. This sort of flexibility made the ladders more practical than an elevator, which would have limited travel to everyone up or everyone down. But Maccabeus knew the ladders had one more advantage. They tended to keep you humble. Before taking control of rapid conversion, the chieftain had been obliged to give a Sangheili delegation a tour so they could verify he hadn't repaired any of the prescribed systems. But the delegation had another item on their agenda. Immediately after the 2 commanders and their Helios guards had come aboard, they began to call out all the reasons why the cruiser was no longer worthy of a Sangheili commission. Starting with the size of the hangar bay where the tour began, one commander emphasized how small the space was, how it could only hold a handful of craft, and even then, only those of lesser type. As a list of flaws grew, Maccabeus had nodded in polite agreement, slowly leading the party toward the shaft. The second commander had boasted that gravity lifts were now ubiquitous on even the smallest Sangheili ships, and the first sniped that only on a vessel such as this, a thing best used for target practice, would one find a device as obsolete as a mechanical lift. Indeed, the Sangheili commander had disdained, delivering the next line in a rehearsed critique. Given the limitations of its crew, I wonder how long even such a simple system will remain functional. You are right, my lords, Maccabeus had replied, his deep voice earnest. In truth, the elevator proved so beyond our capabilities that we were forced to remove it. The Sangheili commanders had shared a confused glance, but before either of them could ask how Maccabeus intended them to inspect the upper decks, the chieftain had used his powerful arms to pull himself up onto a ladder, leaving the Sangheili staring dumbfounded up the shaft. In his lifetime, Maccabeus had humbled many foes, but few victories were as satisfying as hearing those pompous Sangheili struggle up and down the ladders. Unlike the Jiralhanae and other Covenant bipedal species, Sangheili's knees bent forward, not backwards. This unusual hinging didn't impede their motions on the ground, but it made climbing difficult. By the end of their inspection, the Sangheili were exhausted, mortified, and more than happy to have the crippled cruiser and its cunning barbarian of a shipmaster out of their fleet. This pleasant memory kept Maccabeus in reasonably good spirits, even as he leapt past a passage marked with flashing triangular symbols. These indicated portions of the ship that had fallen into disrepair, in some cases dangerously so, and the chieftain had been forced to lock them for his crew's own safety. In this respect, Maccabeus knew it was the Sangheili who had the last laugh. His crew did have limited technical ability. They had struggled just to keep Rapid Conversion's limited systems from falling apart, and the once mighty vessel really was nothing more than the Ministry of Tranquility's survey tug the Sangheili allowed it to be. The chieftain's mood had been dampened by the time he reached the bottom of the shaft, but as he swung into the passage that led to the hangar's airlock, his gloom quickly became unease. There was death in the hangar. Maccabeus could smell it. When the airlock cycled open, the first thing the chieftain saw was a scorch mark that stretched along the length of the hangar floor. On either side of the mark were the charred carapaces of at least a dozen yanmei, large intelligent insects responsible for rapid conversions upkeep. More of the winged, hard-shelled creatures were perched on the forced hulls of one of the cruiser's 4 spirit dropships. Yanmei's luminous compound eyes were all locked on the cause of the carnage, a Kigyar escape pod that had blasted across the hangar. The dead insects didn't faze Maccabeus. More than 100 Yanmeis infested the warmer decks around Rapid Conversion's jump drive. And while it was true they would not reproduce without a queen, their loss paled in comparison to the pod's other victim, one of the spirit dropships. The craft's low-slung cockpit had stopped the pod's progress, saving another spirit beside it. But the pod had severed the cockpit from its 2 elongated troop bays, crushing it against the far wall to one side of the hangar's flickering energy field exit. The spirit was a total loss. The damage caused by the pod was well beyond the Yanmei's skills. Maccabeus' temper flared. A few angry strides later, and he was across the hangar to where his nephew stood beside the battered pod. The younger Jiralhane was like an anvil, heavy and broad. He was covered in wiry, black hair, from the close-cropped mohawk on his head to the tufts of his wide, 2-toed feet. But his coat was already showing flecks of his uncle's more mature silver. If one were to judge by color alone, the youth was marked for greatness. Though, judging by this mess, Maccabeus growled to himself, he still has much to learn. I'm sorry to have disturbed the feast, uncle. My meat will keep, Tartarus. The chieftain glared at his nephew. My patience will not. What is it you would have me see? Tartarus barked an order to the 10th and final member of Maccabeus' pack, a dun-colored monster by the name of Vorenus, who stood directly beside the pod. Vorenus raised a fist and rapped loudly on the pod's topside hatch. A moment passed. There was a muffled sound of pneumatics as the hatch unlatched, and then the masked face of an Ungoy popped into view. Is your companion well? Tartarus asked. It is better, Dadab replied. The chieftain's mutton chops bristled. Did he detect a hint of obstinacy in the Ungoy's voice? The creatures were hardly known for their courage, but then he noticed the Ungoy wore a deacon's orange tunic. Not a lofty rank, but it did mark the creature as an official ministry representative. Then bring it out, Tartarus growled. A lesser Jiralhane would have torn the uppity Ungoy limb from limb, but Maccabeus smelled more excitement than anger in his nephew's scent. Jiralhane exhibited their emotions via stark shifts in pungent pheromones, and while Tartarus would learn to control these shifts as he grew older, he couldn't help but telegraph that there was something thrilling inside the pod. But the chieftain had no idea just how thrilling until the deacon, now standing with its stumpy feet astride the hatch, reached down into the pod and gently raised the Huragok into view. It was an article of faith that the prophets were uniquely qualified to handle the Forerunner's holy relics, that the Sanshayum, more than any other Covenant species, possessed the intelligence required to create practical technologies from the relic's complex designs. But while it was blasphemy to admit it, everyone in the Covenant knew that the prophets' efforts were greatly aided by the Huragok. The creatures had an uncanny understanding of Forerunner objects. Maccabeus knew, and they could fix almost anything they touched. The chieftain loosed a laugh so unexpectedly hearty that it caused the Yanmei to take flight and disappear into the hangar's exposed ductwork. Of all the Sangheili's restrictions, not letting a Huragok join his crew had been the most crippling. But now here one was, and although it would be a serious crime to let the creature fix intentionally disabled systems, not even the Sangheili could complain if it made necessary repairs. An auspicious start to our hunt, Tartarus. The chieftain clapped a paw onto his nephew's shoulders and gave him a joyful shake. Come, back to the beast while it still has flesh for us to choose. Maccabeus turned to Dadab, who was now carefully handing the Huragok to Vorenus. And if not, the chieftain boomed in the same cordial tone, then our new deacon shall bless a second platter.
Chapter 13.
God, man, those are fucking long. Joe Staten really be writing long ass paragraphs, man. I have been speaking for like 40 minutes straight. Anyway, fire as always. I'm really enjoying this book, and it's going to be sad to finish it and be moving on to one of the other 3 books, probably Halo the Flood. But we are cooking through this book real fucking quick. There are not that many chapters in it. We're more than halfway through. So, doing good. Doing good. Fucking flying through this shit. Anyway, please like, comment, subscribe. Let me know if you're enjoying it. Let me know what book you want to see next. It's going to be Halo the Flood. But also let me know what other franchises you want me to read, or just like standalone books, or literally anything. Let's have a book club. Let's all read together. I like reading, and I'm gonna read myself. I'm gonna more of this with other books. Yeah. Anyway, please like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Fucking hell. Peace.